In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Magazine readers and viewers of Sublation Media, the YouTube channel. This is the first episode of the Sublation Magazine Show. Ashley Frawley is here with me. She's my co-host today. I'm Douglas Lain. Ashley is an editor at Sublation Magazine and Sublation Press. She's also a lecturer at Swansea University, the author of The Semiotics of Happiness, a long-term collaborator with me on the left. And today we're going to be talking about, dialectical thinking and crisis from a variety of perspectives. But I'll unmute Ashley and let her say hello. Hello, Ashley.
Hi, Doug. Thanks so much for trusting me in the the passenger seat here. So I'm really looking forward to what we're going to be talking about today. And I've got a few thoughts that I wanted to share with listeners. So I think this is going to be a really great avenue for us to explore a lot of interesting things that are going on in the news and in politics in general.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing your radar, as if you were on Rising, that's what you would be contributing. We're going to be trying to cover the news cycle a little bit, although I'm always a little bit behind. But right now in the United States, the insurrection hearings are going on. That's the hearings on the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol. From my perspective, there's really only one main question, but it kind of has to be explored before you can answer it or even ask it. So the charges against the members of the pro-Trump mob have ranged from, I'm reading actually from the AP, from low-level misdemeanors for those who only enter the Capitol to felony seditious conspiracy charges against far right-wing extremists. And this is what I wanted to discuss, the idea of sedition and seditious conspiracy as it's coming up right now in these hearings. We're at a time where I'm very concerned about the power of the state clamping down on civil society, on regular people. And I want to read from just what Liz Cheney says this trial is about, and then make a couple points. She says, during the hearings, we'll be hearing about plots to commit seditious conspiracy, which is a crime defined as conspiring to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States, or to oppose by force the authority of the government of the United States. So there are like two questions that arise. The first is that whether or not organizing a protest and a disruption of the certification of the electors amounts to an attempt to overthrow the United States government or to oppose by force the authority of the United States. And then for me, the second question is whether, as a socialist, I ought to concede that sedition laws are acceptable at all. Communists and socialists have been charged with the crime of sedition many times. Eugene Debs would be one example of someone who was charged with sedition and jailed for his opposition to the First World War. And I just find it to be a contradiction in our own legal system and constitution, maybe because the United States government was founded on our natural right for revolution. So that's what I want to raise first. And what do you think about this tension between living in a democratic society founded on the rights of the people to change the government, even by revolutionary force when necessary, and these laws against sedition, the sedition laws?
This is a tricky case, and it's actually instructive because you want to treat your enemies as you would like to be treated. It's the golden rule. No, but you want to, any kind of, however you resolve this, you know it's going to come back and affect you. And there's this tendency, I think, to want to big up our enemies and make them into, because the left often defines itself against something else as opposed to for something. We have this big problem. We've had it for a long time, sort of end of history discourse. It makes it difficult for us to imagine that we might be in that position ourselves, that we may be fighting for a revolution, for something greater. I mean, we do talk about it, but it's so far off. It's so distant. And so, you know, we want to like big this up as this really big threat and then come down really hard on it. And then that, of course, can turn back and affect us in a really dangerous way. And you can see the analog for this in all sorts of rights and freedoms, like freedom of speech, where we are quite blasé about freedom of speech when it comes to our enemies. And then we're very shocked when the very same forms of clamping down on free speech that we champion for our enemies then get used against us. And that shouldn't be surprising at all. So to tread very carefully here. But I'm not sure, Doug, what you think about that.
Well, I'm going to, before we started this live stream, we were asking each other, when do we want to start responding to comments in the chat? And maybe at the end, maybe not at all, but I'm going to respond to one right now. Someone says, I don't think it's reasonable to expect a social body to permit its own violent overthrow. And my response to that is this: when you have a system of government that requires its own violent overthrow in order to make the kinds of changes necessary for the population to feel as though they live as equals and in a free manner in order to pursue their own happiness, then no number of laws are going to stop violence and even organized violence, perhaps against the state. So for the state, it's not a matter of whether it's going to permit its own violent overthrow, but rather how can it set up institutions and processes whereby the citizens have the ability to make fundamental changes to it in order for the state to serve them better. So it's the wrong way to think about this as to whether or not a social body or a state would permit its own violent overthrow, but rather how do we want our government to be structured, whether or not we want to live in a state which would make it illegal to oppose it or want to overturn it. Are we in service of the state, or is it in service to us? Would be my question.
Yeah, and I think it's also a bit dangerous and worrisome that these sorts of issues come on to the agenda when it is demonstrably a right-wing issue, because then the impulse is, well, like, clamp down on it as hard as you can. I think the hardest thing at the moment too is the issue of gun control, because it's like so obviously a problem in the United States. And yet there has been a long tradition on the left of fighting against disarming the people, because you need to be able to, at a certain point, possibly fight back against the state. So the idea of allowing the state monopoly on violence is something that has long been opposed. But you cannot make that argument right now. No chance. Because it's so out of control in the United States. There's no answer to it. But it's a shame, because it's come up at a time where the obvious answer is disarm, right? I mean, things have gone in such a direction that that's just the most obvious thing. And so now this is coming up, the idea of sedition and so on, when it's our enemies. And so the obvious answer is, well, clamp down on it, right? But can we envision a future in which this comes back? That's the hardest thing to do, is can we envision a future in which this comes back to haunt us?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's that difficult to imagine a future where that comes back to haunt us, where these kinds of sedition charges come back and turn back on the left, because we are already in a moment where the high-tech censorship, which was at first aimed against right-wing figures, has come back. in a very profound way against the left. The invasion of Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has created conditions in which political expression is being curtailed, I would argue, by the state online, that the state has put pressure on the industry to stop any kind of argumentation in favor of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Not that I am doing that, but I'm objecting to the limitation of our speech. And even, I think, justified criticism of the U.S. response to that invasion has been muted by state action right now. So we can see that our rights and our ability to organize is being limited by the state. And when you empower the right of the state to take away even your enemies' civil liberties, that you are endangering your own. So, and right now it's a pretty profound situation. We need to be able to think together and to speak freely. But let's talk about mass shootings. You brought it up just a moment ago. Todd McGowan was going to be here. I invited him, but he's unfortunately on the road. He's on a family trip on it's summer, I guess, or almost, and it's on a family vacation.
How dare he have a personal life? My God.
I know. I imagine him in a station wagon, like in the movie Vacation with Chevy Chase, having all sorts of problems.
I pictured that too.
But anyway, so he's not here, but he did write an essay for us in Sublation Magazine. He has a book coming out with us called Enjoyment, Right and Left. And it's his essay in Sublation Magazine on enjoying mass shootings was kind of built out of that book that he wrote for us. So it's the essay he wrote was How to Enjoy Shooting. And he argued in that essay, did you get a chance to read that one,
Ashley? Of course, I read every single article in our magazine, but for the viewers, can you explain?
Yeah, okay. Well, in that essay, he argued from a Lacanian perspective that that there's a kind of right-wing enjoyment of the mass shooting itself, that the mass shooting perversely props up the proliferation of guns and the gun culture in the United States. And he wrote, here's an excerpt from what he wrote. He said, right-wing enjoyment is an enjoyment always under siege. For this to occur, there has to be an endless supply of enemies or omnipresent threats. If these threats don't exist, then they have to be fantasized into existence. In this form of enjoyment, one's own form of life takes on a value because an enemy is always trying to take it away. So he is claiming here in How to Enjoy Shooting that these events, like in schools and grocery stores, where there's a massacre, won't ever motivate enough people uniformly or universally to do something about the guns that we have and to implement what I would argue would be rational forms of gun control that are necessary forms of gun control, because the gun culture and the violence that it brings supports a right-wing way of life, a right-wing form of enjoyment. But in my essay, I wrote, I know you saw my essay too. You especially looked for that one. I wrote that that we might step out of the usual framing that surrounds these events and not ask about whether or not there are too many guns or not enough guns, but to ask about the initial conditions that set up the mass shooter as a reactionary. So Todd says that there's a right-wing enjoyment to the shooting, and I would say that that the actual shooters enjoy what they do as a way out of what they must feel is a hopeless life and a miserable prospect for any kind of future. and that actually there's something to the, I don't know, but my idea was that when you don't have a path towards changing your own situation and society, the society that sets up your situation, that some people will end up in this position where their only recourse that they can imagine anyway is to just act out and try to make everything explode and die, including themselves. And that when we try to foreclose the possibility of change and a future, that what we'll get are these moments of violent reaction.
Well, if you think about it, I might be taking this too far, but let's go for it. The ideology of capitalism appears as its opposite, which is anti-capitalism. So that's the prevailing ideology. It's not, oh, this is such a wonderful system. You know, this is so great. Everything's great. We just love it. Don't we just love it? No, it's like a thinking person. You are an anti-capitalist, and anti-capitalism takes all these sorts of romanticized forms, psychologized forms, and so on. But that is the prevailing ideology of the culture. It appears to subvert the culture, but in doing so, it actually upholds it. Because one, you say, I'm not really part of this. I'm not, and so you can step back. And because there's and two, because by rejecting mass culture, you feed the search for new things and new commodities. Something gets massified, and then you're looking for the new experience. But because there's no kind of movement that gives any kind of voice or coherence to anti-capitalism, it becomes a kind of nihilistic stepping away from the culture, or you kind of opt out. And opting out can take all sorts of forms. You get your chickens and you have your community garden, and you try to find your little space in the cracks that capitalism opens and all of that kind of thing. Or you become destructive. So it's like the ultimate, most horrific expression of a kind of nihilistic ideology that seeps into capitalism. That, I always use this quote from the Grundrisse, but Marx calls romantic anti-capitalism this like subversion of capitalism that looks back, oh, everything was so much better in the past. That looks back to this imagined past before the fall. He calls this capitalism's legitimate antithesis. And he says bourgeois society has never got beyond it, and it will accompany capitalism up to its bitter end. This is the legitimate antithesis of capitalism, is this kind of romanticism, this romantic rejection of everything that is. And I think it takes these particularly perverse forms in certain areas of the world, but it's expressed in all sorts of different ways. I mean, you can even see it in kind of religious violence in the UK. This incredible, like they take it so far, but the rejection of mainstream society is something you hear from teenagers. It's just a very, very extreme form of it. So the rejection takes a lot of different forms, but it's a rejection that has no purpose, that has no coherence in a sort of broader anti-capitalist movement. And so you experience it in all these horrific nihilistic ways.
Yeah, and the whole concept of the teenager is that person who, through a failure to integrate, come of age, is rejecting society.
Yes.
The idea of the teenager arose after World War II, and one of the first icons of the teenager is like James Dean and Rebel Without a Cause, right? So from the beginning, the teenager and the nihilist have been sort of connected, and to be a teenager is to attempt to reject the society you're brought into. But on the left, that's why we love teenagers and young people. It's because we look to them and say, okay, they're rejecting the society as it is. They want to change the society. They're always coming along as a force for change. But unfortunately, all too often, it's this sort of romantic, anti-capitalist, anti-social force for change.
It's a bait that we shouldn't take, because the goal isn't just to reject. The goal is to sublate. The goal is to destroy, but bring to to create on a higher foundation. That remember that the central kind of idea of Marx is that socialism is built on the foundation of capitalism. You don't just abolish everything. It's also silly, very silly to think that you would, because that's not how history progresses. I mean, we still have the vestiges of a lot of feudal society as well, because new societies are built on the foundation of the old. But as the old, for instance, basis of production, which once is a powerful force for the creation of wealth and so on, begins to become a fetter to hold back production, then these forces burst forth into a new society, become the foundation of a new society. You don't just destroy, you sublate, you bring to a higher level what existed before. So it's tempting to kind of say, oh yes, you have that youthful rebellion, that rejection, but also it's that our politics is not just about rejection, it's about sublation, it's about taking to a higher level, destroying and taking to a higher level.
I really appreciate you dropping the brand name into the conversation as often as you do. But I also agree with you. Maybe this would be a good moment for you to have your say on a topic that's in the news in the UK. We both were going to bring up topics to discuss at the start, and we'll be doing that each week. I hope that you can keep coming back as my regular co-host, Ashley, at least semi-regularly. But what you wanted to talk about the way the politicians are being judged in the UK, I think it's one way to think of it.
So there's we've just sort of come to the end of a sort of news cycle in the UK that's been focused around the fact that policymakers appeared to have some parties in Parliament during lockdowns. And it seems to me that they were playing fast and loose with rules that they themselves clearly didn't believe in. I mean, at that time when this was happening in June 2020, just some of the things were happening. They were saying that the UK public was not afraid enough of coronavirus. And they were bringing like rolly suitcases of wine to and like vomiting and like getting so drunk, like fights were breaking out, that kind of thing. It was like quite raucous kind of time in Westminster. And so they themselves were not afraid. Anyway, so this was a big deal in the news, and there was a no confidence vote against the UK Prime Minister, which he just narrowly survived, and he's trying to draw a line under it, and is kind of uncertain whether or not he will. But what I found very interesting, I just came back from a conference as well in London, and I was reading through the papers before the presentations, and one of the papers said something about flawless authoritarians. We kind of live in this world of these flawless authoritarians who have these rules and so on, and that they subject everyone to. And I thought, no, although the point that she made was good, it just made me think immediately, we're not living in a time of flawless authoritarians. It's the exact opposite. We're living in a time of flawed authoritarians. Like think about like cancel culture, right? Mm-hmm. If it did exist, you can see that there's this kind of perverse joy that when someone who's been doing canceling makes a misstep themselves and then gets canceled, right? We all really enjoy, look how the high have fallen. Or like, I just finished a research project, or I'm still kind of working on it, on mindfulness. And one thing that I noticed was the policymakers were having these mindfulness movements meetings in Parliament. And they were talking about how they themselves were incapable of managing their emotions and how helpful it was and how flawed they were. And they're making this big spectacle of it. Or CEOs were talking about how they themselves find it very difficult to self-govern and so on. A CEO even referred to a mindfulness app as the ultimate in mind control for workers, totally unironically. Did not even have a sense of what that could be, how that could be interpreted. Just this idea that we're all so flawed, and we make this huge spectacle. Even Angela Merkel was like, sort of like, oh, she went in somewhere without a mask, But this doesn't make us question the rules. By contrast, we actually become even more believers in the COVID rules than we were at the time, because at the time we weren't applying in the UK the COVID rules that stringently. There was a big sort of a furore about somebody who took this very long drive that he was questionably within the rules, and it was like decided that it wasn't in the public interest to apply the rules quite so stringently. Now we're like applying the letter of the law after the fact. And what I find very interesting about this kind of like joy at pointing out how flawed our like human leaders is that I think it masks a kind of sinister impulse where the rules become like these biblical commandments that are handed down from on high that we weak people must strive to respond to and live up to. And even our leaders can't. And at least with like a military junta, you have the general at the top, right? There's this human that oversees the rules. Now, no, it's like, oh, human, all too human. And I think this kind of opens the door for more surveillance, more digital surveillance, more kinds of inhuman surveillance. I think we have to be very, very careful about this. It's just something that I'm thinking about. It's very undeveloped at the moment, but I feel like the more that we start to think about our problems as emanating from people having too much freedom, and yet even our leaders being unable to surveil us, the more we invite these kinds of electronic forms of surveillance, which I find so interesting. There's just in like my mental health research, they're like, oh, we're developing these apps that can diagnose you based on your eye movements when you look at your phone.
Oh, God.
Oh, brave new world that has such things in it. You know, and this is, and the technology sucks. You know, like they have this faith. These people who want to bring in these technologies, they have this faith in this technology. Oh, that's the future. That is totally divorced from the actual possibilities of the technology. It's not like the technology is there and it's making it possible, and this gives them the idea. It's that they have no faith in human beings, and that's why they're looking to technology. I think that's a really scary development.
Yeah, the other thing I want to point out about this focus on individual mores and the failures of the politicians to live up to their own rules, after retroactively applying penalties to people for not being not living up to the regulations that had arose during COVID, as if that's should be one of the primary concerns. Is that what that does is it individualizes the question of COVID, it naturalizes those conditions and treats the whole of it as a moral question of personal valor or failure, rather than asking, how did these conditions arise? And I mean, right now, that's a real question that is being investigated, but poorly. Like we still don't have any kind of conclusive answers to whether or not COVID arose in nature, jumping from one species to another and then to humans, or whether it was a leak from the Wuhan lab or some other lab. These are questions that remain unresolved, let alone the question of our unpreparedness and the lack of masks, the lack of the ability to test. The way in which our boundaries remain porous, even as the conditions were known. All these questions, which could have some implications for future actions, are left unresolved. But
absolutely.
There's clearly an ideological aim, or anyway, a consequence to the kind of focus on individual mores.
It's a question of human frailty instead of whether or not what we did was the right thing.
Right. Listen, we've got Reid Kane here waiting. He's in the green room, which on StreamYard is just a screen at the bottom of our screen that we can see and no one else can. There's no refreshments there. It's very alienating to be left in that space. So I'm going to bring him up and I'm going to send you away, Ashley, but I'll bring you back in a bit, okay? So here is Reid Kane. Reid, welcome to the Sublation Magazine Show. And you recently wrote for us. You're a YouTuber of the YouTube channel Socialist Legacy.
That's right.
And you're an author for Sublation Magazine.
Yes.
And your piece was called Once More on Contradictions. in
That's right.
Sublation. Which is great because again, it's on brand, right? The name of the thing is Sublation. You're writing about contradictions and the Hegelian and Marxist contradictions, so I appreciate that. But I wanted to ask you about your essay. It was sort of written as a response to or criticism of another piece one written by Matt McManus, and his was called On Contradictions and Dialectics. But it seemed to me that it might also have just been written as an explanation, because you start your piece by explaining why it is that Hegelian dialectics and Marxist understandings of contradiction have become obscure and difficult now, and when they might not have been in the 19th century. So why is it more difficult today than it has been in the past to understand dialectical thinking?
Right. Well, thank you for having me, Doug. I'm very happy to be here and very honored to be published in Sublation Magazine.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting. So I actually just read Matt McManus's response to my piece, which was recently published in Sublation as well.
Mm-hmm.
And he, in his piece, accuses me of kind of counter-arguing to him that whereas he says, contradiction in Marxist theory is obscure and needs a certain amount of clarification, that I was arguing that it's not actually obscure or hard to understand, which really, I think he's missing the point of my essay, which is I agree with him that contradiction in Marx and Marxist theory more generally is very difficult to understand today and obscure. But as you point out, I think there is an historical explanation for why that's the case. And I think you can trace that explanation back to Marx's own work. It's a problem that Marx was already dealing with in a different form in his own lifetime. And that's why I focus in my article primarily on the afterword to the second German edition of Capital, which is famous for his remark about turning Hegel on his head. That's where he makes that famous remark about inverting the Hegelian dialectic. But he begins that afterword with a kind of a sort of response to a number of different critics in the bourgeois sort of intellectual milieu, responding to kind of generally the sort of cold reception he receives among political economists in France and Germany, and sort of explaining why he thinks that's the case. And he attributes that to what he calls the vulgarity of the bourgeois thinkers, and specifically political economists of that time, so 1860s, 1870s, and already going back to the 1840s and even earlier. And so what I tried to do in my piece was kind of get at that concept of the vulgarization of bourgeois thought and what Marx thought the historical roots of that were. Basically, that the inability for bourgeois intellectuals to grasp the problem of capitalism was a symptom of that problem itself. It was the intellectual or ideological expression of the contradiction that was manifesting in other forms as well, in a variety of forms in society. And in terms of McManus's piece, I think there's a kind of broader problem that develops in the 20th century, which is not simply that bourgeois intellectuals are unable to understand Marxist theory, because of course Marx didn't really care. Marx was sort of bemused that these bourgeois reviewers didn't get what he was talking about, because that wasn't really the audience he cared about. I mean, he cared to an extent. He wanted to have some esteem because he wanted to be able to publish more. But really, he was writing for the proletarian socialist movement. And he was, he had a direct political intervention in mind when he was producing the Critique of Political Economy in the first place. So, and he, for that matter, is, he says in that piece that he's, encouraged by the reception he has been getting amongst the German working class. So the problem today, and really going back into, say, the mid 20th century, is a different problem. it's a related problem, but a different problem. Namely that the audience for which Marx was writing failed to achieve its goal, the goal that Marx was attempting to help them achieve. And as a consequence of that failure, the movement came into crisis. It collapsed and disintegrated first into a number of splinters, the big splinters, social democracy versus communism, and then of course all the number of sectarian offshoots of those various splinters. And to the point where today there's hardly even any kind of organized expression of socialism at all, save DSA, and a handful of others that are still lingering from the past. But to make a long story short, there is a sort of absence of the sort of audience Marx was writing for, and so the same sort of inability to grasp what he was trying to do with his dialectical critique of capitalism is a broader problem now, because he isn't able to expect the sort of reception in terms of a theoretical clarification of a practical political struggle that he did during his lifetime. I think that's what McManus is missing.
Yeah, well, I have a couple of questions that I want to ask to clarify, because everything that you just said, I agree with and I think I understand, but it still, to me, leaves the question of what it means to grasp capitalism and the totality of its contradictions unanswered. Which maybe we have to do in action as well as theory, but we ought to be able to do it in theory. We ought to at least describe in kind of abstract conceptual terms just what dialectical thinking is, or what the basis of what a contradiction is in Marxist theory and Hegelian theory. And that's what McManus's original piece was aiming to do, not to describe the history of the failure of socialism and the failure, therefore, to take up Marxist critique, but rather to just explain what Marxist critique was abstractly and conceptually. But I want to ask you a question. It might help us understand the details of the contradictions that Marx was talking about, and you describe them. It's the proletarian condition of being condemned for life to wage labor. I'm quoting you here. Unable to acquire property, capital, was thus symptomatic of the Industrial Revolution as the self-contradiction of bourgeois social relations. The society of labor, in its mature development, undermined the value of labor precisely by developing the capacities of labor, its productivity, through the socialization of the labor process. Capital, as a means of social production, embodied this developing productivity, and hence the self-undermining dynamic of labor, rather than resulting in the emancipation of humanity from the burden of labor in favor of free time beyond the material necessity, beyond the compulsion to toil to secure the means of life. Capital represented the privation of this potential freedom from workers, its transformation into an alien force dominating them, in relation to which they were increasingly dispensable and therefore subordinate. That's me quoting you. And my question to you is, how is it that industrial production undermines the value of labor, and how is that expressed, or how does it appear?
Mm-hmm. So going back to the historical roots of the problem, so if you look at Das Kapital, for example, there's the famous chapter in the section on absolute surplus value on the working day. And in that, Marx is describing the struggle between the owners of commodity production enterprises, the owners of the means of producing commodities, the struggle between the owners and the wage laborers they employ over the extent of the working day, the length of the working day. So the most primitive form in which capital is accumulated, in which surplus value is expropriated from the workers, is through extending the length of the working day as long as possible. And the idea there being that you pay the worker enough to come back to work the next day, but the longer you can make them work, the more you get to keep over and against what you have to pay them. Pretty simple concept. Now, at this stage, while this is in a sense the root of the problem of capitalism, we're not really in capitalism proper. We're still talking about a sort of proto or pre-capitalist condition, in the sense that the mature expression of capitalism is, or of capital per se, the emergence of capital per se as a kind of concrete problem, is with the emergence of the machine as an automaton in which the labor process confronts not only the workers, but also the capitalists, but more importantly, in this context, the workers, as something over which, as an alien force dominating them, over which they have no control. So as long as you're dealing with your employer, and specifically your employer and, say, the management, of the factory, as long as you're confronting them as individuals, you have a mass of workers against a small number of owners. So, I mean, in theory, you have pretty good odds in that struggle, as long as you're able to coordinate with your fellow workers. Now, of course, there's the question of the state and society and how those enter into the equation. But leaving that aside for the moment, this problem of the conflict between wage laborers and employers is not a problem unique to the 19th century or to Marxist context. You don't need Marx to explain this conflict to you. It's already there in The Wealth of Nations in Adam Smith. In the chapter on wages, Adam Smith talks about how there is an inherent tendency in the owners of stock to exploit their workers, to try to get as much as they can from their workers and to push down the conditions in which they are, in which they're producing. And the only recourse that the workers have in this situation, they don't have any recourse as individuals because they're dependent on someone else for employment, not owning the means of producing commodities themselves. So unlike a small proprietor that can produce their own commodities. So what can the workers do? Well, the only recourse they have is combination. In other words, what we would now call, or what in the 19th century became known as unions, trade unions. So the workers can combine their efforts to try to confront their employer and dictate the terms of employment, or at least negotiate the terms of their employment. The problem with all of this, and this is all, as I said, this is all within the horizon of Adam Smith. This is all perfectly compatible with the conception of society that the bourgeois revolution institutes. It's a struggle, but the struggle is constitutive of society. In a sense, there's a knock-on good effect to it, right? It's, in a sense, leading the workers to take more charge, to take more power in their social relationships, and to generate more wealth in that regard. The problem, however, is something that Adam Smith could not have anticipated and did not foresee, and that only really comes into focus after the turn of the 19th century. It's already developing before that, but it only really becomes a conscious problem after the turn of the 19th century. And that's the fact that in order to overcome this limitation of absolute surplus value, which on the one hand is the fact that it meets the attempt to expand the production of absolute surplus value by extending the length of the working day, meets resistance from the workers, but also the fact that there is a fundamental limit to the extent of absolute surplus value extraction, because the day only has so many hours. And even if you deprived your workers of sleep, there's only 24 hours in which they can work. And of course, they wouldn't be working very long if you drove them to work for 24 hours. So the sort of organized conscious resistance of the workers is really just an expression of a sort of physical limitation that they themselves embody and suffer from, right? So the problem that the capitalists face is, well, how do we overcome this limitation in our drive to maximize profit and in our drive to maximize the production of surplus value? And the solution presents itself in relative surplus value extraction, which comes with the introduction of machinery. And what that involves...
What is relative? Yeah. What is relative extraction?
Relative surplus value. So instead of extending the length of the production period so that you're extracting more value over and above what you have to pay for the wage, the period of the day in which labor is reproduced versus the period in which surplus value is produced. Relative surplus value is when you drive down the amount necessary to pay the laborer by increasing the productivity of labor. So the first form in which this takes is, the most kind of elementary form, and the reason the capitalists would implement labor-saving machinery that increases the productivity of labor. so that in the same length of time, the laborers you have produce this much more rather than having to work that much longer to produce more. The first form this takes, of course, is the capitalists that have the machinery can outcompete the other capitalists. And they can also, of course, outcompete, so to speak, their workers, because they can lay them off, right? And they can find workers who are less skilled because they don't need as much skill to operate the machinery. They don't need these inherited skills that they've carried down from the craft production system. So they can lay those workers off. They can hire unskilled workers. They can hire women and children in the 19th century that wouldn't be employed otherwise, and who aren't, don't have these developed relationships of resistance because they are fresh into the workforce. So, you have that advantage over the workers, and you also have the advantage over other capitalists who are relying on more labor-intensive production processes, because you, for the same length of time that you're employing your workers and running your workshop, you're able to produce this much more. So you're able to save, in that regard, you're able to produce more commodities with the same resources, and you're able to profit that much more over and above them. But
but the price per unit of commodity goes down.
Yes. So there is,
which is why you can pay your workers less.
Right.
Because the commodities of consumption, those prices are going to drop as the production time needed to produce them decreases.
So that's the initial impulse. But then, of course, every capitalist that can afford to stay in the industry, and some won't, some will be unable to compete and fall out of that industry and maybe become proletarians or maybe find another line of work. But the capitalists that do have the resources to stay in the industry will also invest in that level of technological innovation. And hence the advantage, the short-term advantage that the capitalists get from using this machinery will be equalized. It will be leveled out. But what then happens is the cost of reproducing labor power will ultimately drop, because, as you note, the price of the commodities will start to fall. And the price of the commodities the workers have to purchase to subsist, the cost of their food, clothing, shelter, will tend to fall. So you can pay your workers less. And in that way, you can drive wages down. So in that regard, there is a secondary effect of increasing the rate of surplus value extraction, because you are able to reduce the cost of labor, the cost of labor power for the capitalist.
But the problem with that is that, meanwhile, the value of your commodities, even as the number of them increase, at a certain point, the value of the commodities that you produce will decline as well. So you become, this is part of the reason why there's a tendency for the rate of profit to decline. Something I love to talk about. But so when you say that the labor undermines itself, it's not simply a matter of being undermined in terms of their political power or being exploited, but also that the literal value of the labor as embodied in commodities declines.
The value of, sorry, Doug.
Yeah, as their productivity increases.
Right. The value of their labor power to be
right. The value, no, not necessarily the value of their labor power, could be, but the value of their abstract labor, the time they spend producing, declines as well. And certainly the value of their labor power, as a wage, that declines as well. Especially if the wages drop.
Right? The real point is that it becomes cheaper for the workers to live, and therefore it becomes cheaper for the capitalists to employ them, because they can pay them less. They can afford to pay them less.
I mean, the proletariat can't even arrive on the scene until there's a level of commodity production to support a class of people who have nothing to sell but their labor, and therefore rely on a wage to live.
Right. So when we're talking about the world of the working day chapter, the world of where absolute surplus value extraction is the extent of surplus value production, we're talking about, like, as I said, a sort of proto-capitalist situation, because we're not talking about generalized commodity production at this point. We're not talking about the generalization of wage labor as the form in which the overwhelming majority of labor is taking in society. We're talking about a situation in which there is commodity production that's taking on an increasingly significant role in society. But for that matter, not all commodities are produced by wage laborers, or at least not large scale, organizations of wage labor. There is still relatively small scale home production, and the apprenticeship mastery system is still in place and hasn't been fully transformed into what we would now recognize as employer-employee relations.
So there's
and
a lot
so
of
on.
production for your own personal use.
And there's still a lot of peasant production. There's still a lot of
Right.
subsistence production on the land. Although a lot
Right.
of agricultural labor has been proletarianized at this point, it hasn't been so entirely.
But Marx was most interested in the proletariat,
Right.
which is that class of wage laborers who have nothing to sell but their labor. And so what we're talking about here is an example of contradiction that Marx saw, right?
So to kind of hammer the point home,
Mhm.
the point I was trying to make about bringing up the working day chapter is that the development of capital in this kind of developed sense of the machine, not to reduce capital to the machine, but it takes this form of appearance of the machine, confronting the laborer, and the proletarianization of labor, which is facilitated by the emergence of machine production. So as soon as you're able to have these large scale commodity production enterprises based on machine systems, it drives the proletarianization of labor, because it drives small scale production and subsistence production out of existence. But the point being that it's the struggle of the workers to, in a sense, have their bourgeois freedom as workers, to not be driven to the brink of exhaustion in the working day, but to fairly negotiate with their employer, by voluntarily associating with their fellow workers, to negotiate with their employer, to have a fair labor contract, to have a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. It was that struggle to kind of demand their bourgeois rights that led to the emergence of capitalism in that sense, right?
Led to the introduction of the machine to speed up production,
right,
in order to be able to meet the demands of workers for a shorter working day.
Exactly. And then that kind of comes back to bite them, of course, right? So that's the sense in which it's a contradiction, a self-contradiction. It's the very desire to demand their bourgeois rights, their bourgeois freedom, that undermines that freedom through the emergence of capitalism. It's in a sense a contradiction, in the sense that the premises of the argument lead to a conclusion that is contradicting those premises, right? The outcome contradicts the goal that you start with. So that's the sense of contradiction.
Yeah. So now I want to ask you one last question. Then I want to keep you on and just keep talking about this forever. But
sure.
I feel like we should move on, because I want to at least run a clip from Margaret Kimberley here.
Sure.
So what did McManus miss? I mean, what was the central conceptual error in McManus's explanation of contradiction? Because I think he might have, if he would listen to our conversation up to this point, may not see anything that he disagrees with in it.
Sure.
So what do you think that he missed?
Well, in his initial piece, I wasn't so, and while it was sort of written as a response to Matt's piece, it wasn't really like a thoroughgoing criticism of what he wrote. I really was more taking his article as a point of departure to explain a related topic, which is this idea of the vulgarization, or the regression, if you will, of consciousness. And I did make a few critical remarks about Matt's piece, but I honestly didn't find a whole lot there to argue with, because I felt like it was a brief piece, kind of making a sort of relatively simple point. And, I don't want to nitpick that. I'm not really interested in kind of nitpicking. I did make a few nitpicks, but I didn't really, it's not so much that I thought he had a conceptual error, as that there was something he was leaving out of his argument that I thought was very important to highlight. To the extent that there was what I think would be an error, he kind of counter argues that I'm mistaken in his response. So to be fair to him, but I think it's wrong to understand contradiction, and this goes back to Hegel and Hegel's sense of contradiction. It's wrong to see contradiction as a matter of a conflict or an antagonism between two separate phenomena. So the contradiction of capitalism is not the conflict or the struggle, for that matter, between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Or in McManus's article, he talks about, and he gets this from David Harvey, a contradiction between the state and private property. Right. And so, he comes back at me in his response by saying, well, Marx does talk about antagonism, and it's wrong for a Marxist to deny.
Well, you did too in your story
of
how the 40-hour day
Yes.
had to be struggled for, and there was an antagonism between the bosses and the workers. But that isn't the contradiction.
Right.
That is the engine in which the contradiction is expressed.
Absolutely right. Right. So he, he kind of comes back at me on those grounds, but I would say obviously there's antagonism and struggle and conflict in society. And these are expressions of the underlying contradiction, the contradictory character of the society. There are forms in which it's expressed, if you'd like, ideological forms through which the conflict has to be fought through, right? To use Marx's phrase. So, and some, maybe some antagonisms and conflicts are more interesting and worth engaging with than others. But ultimately, yes, there are antagonisms, but the contradiction can't be reduced to the conflict between two opposed phenomena. The contradiction is the self-contradiction of the underlying totality, right? It's the society that these various classes are part of, and phenomena like private property and the state are part of and expressions of. It's the underlying social form that is contradicting itself, undermining itself. And these various antagonisms and conflicts that emerge in society are the ways in which that gets expressed, or some of the ways in which that gets expressed.
All right.
So,
and then
great.
Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, just a final point is that, of course, the significance of the class struggle for Marx is that for Marx, the proletariat, not by virtue of having an antagonism or having a struggle on its hands, but by virtue of its increasing conscious grasp of its historical conditions, the historical conditions of the struggle, and along with that, its aspiration to overcome this historical situation. Which was represented by the interest the working class was developing in the ideas of the socialists of the time in the 1830s, 1840s. It was by virtue of that for Marx, the struggle of the proletariat, the antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie was especially significant, because it represented an element of this society striving for consciousness of this contradiction in order to work through and overcome that contradiction. That's what for Marx was significant about the proletariat and its class struggle.
All right. Listen, people can find you on YouTube at The Socialist Legacy. You're going to continue writing for Sublation Magazine, I hope. You're on our Twitch.
Yes,
right?
I was going to say, I've been streaming every Tuesday at 5 Eastern time. On the Sublation Media Twitch channel as well.
Yeah, with Clint.
Yes.
And all right, so that's great. People should check all of that out. Thank you, Reid, for coming on to the first Sublation Magazine show. I'm going to remove you from the channel now.
Thank
Goodbye. You, Ashley, we are at nearly an hour, and I'm wondering if what we might do at this point, Stefan, I'm going to bring you in. Maybe if you're going to stick around, Stefan, maybe you and I could talk for patrons, and we'll set that conversation up by running the clip from Margaret Kimberley now, and then people who want to hear us discuss that can come over to the Patreon and sign up, and I'll give them, everybody who signs up at $5 today will get access to the Patreon live stream. But Ashley, any comments, or either of you guys, any comments on how it's gone so far? You gotta unmute yourself, Ashley.
Stefan, you're muted as well.
Yeah.
You'd think after all this time we would get used to having to unmute ourselves, but no. Well, Stefan, as the viewer,
unmuting Ashley that I forgot to unmute myself.
So, Stefan, as a viewer, how are you feeling about Sublation Magazine so far?
The show.
The show.
I mean, I wasn't paying that much attention.
Oh, great. All right, bye. All right, we'll talk.
Oh, no.
Okay, so So yeah, Ashley, I'm going to show you this clip from Margaret Kimberley. This is going to be an hour-long interview later this week, maybe tomorrow or the next day, one of those two. I also have an interview with Bhaskar Sankara, which is going to run this week, but I've decided we've run out of time to run that clip, so I'm going to run this one and share it with you now, and we can comment a little bit about it, and then we'll say goodbye to everybody and go to the Patreon. So here is the clip with Margaret Kimberley from the Black Agenda Report and the Freedom Writer column as well. So here we go. Let's see if I can get this to work. Kind of get rid of the kind of corruption that dominated Ukraine to get to some sort of formal bourgeois democracy. Not
It's really quiet.
Utopia, but just sort of like we'll enter the EU. We'll have some sort of industry. We'll get rid of all this. We won't have to bribe every official in our life to get things done. We'll have a functioning society. That's what he kind of promised. And from my perspective, because of the conflict between NATO, the United States, and Russia, that dream was completely crushed by both sides.
Sure.
Yeah, so I bring that up just to say that the problem here is you can't really cast the Ukrainian people now, the Ukrainian nation, as merely a puppet of the United States, because there was a force for reform that was maybe not as strong as it should have been. It's definitely facing a lot of setbacks. And I'm not saying like Zelensky is some sort of saint, but there was an attempt to change that society going on, and he couldn't control it. Like there's Blumenthal mentions this, like he would go to Donbass and say, look, I want a ceasefire, turn in your weapons. And they were like, who the hell are you? And he says, I'm not some loser. I'm the president of Ukraine.
Yes.
So, it's a really difficult situation overall. And one of the things that I asked Blumenthal, and maybe I'll just ask this to you, is why do you think it is that Russia and the United States, Russia and NATO, developed this conflict after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Why wasn't there a solid attempt to bring Russia into NATO? Why couldn't there be a settling of the disagreements and the conflicts between Russia and the Western world?
Well, a couple of things. You're right about Zelensky. He won by campaigning for peace. He said he would end the war in Donbass. But these forces, while that's what the people, it's kind of like the US, where politicians say things because they know that's what people want. So that's what the people wanted. But the people who really control Ukraine, the oligarchic class, they don't want to change anything. The oligarch who sponsored him, a guy named Kolomoisky, is, and I want to point out something else here, who, like Zelensky, is also Jewish, but he also funds the Azov battalion. These fascists, these neo-Nazis are muscle for the oligarchic class. And someone explained it to me as, being fascist there is more about being anti-Russian. And that is an explanation for how Jews can be supportive of them. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'll go with that. But you're absolutely right about Zelensky. He did want to bring about peace, but those forces did not want him to. And to have this military, like the Azov battalion, these people are an obstacle to peace, an obstacle to getting rid of corruption, because they exist to continue the war, to continue their protection for the corrupt people. And Ukraine is one of the poorest countries in Europe, one of the most kleptocratic. So I wanted to say that just to back up what you were saying. But the whole point about Russia and NATO is not what we're told it is. It's not this defensive alliance. It's an aggressive alliance. And a lot of their aggression is to try to, there was this, and it's a fantasy, and these people unfortunately are in power to break up Russia, to contain Russia. And it's It isn't going to happen. It's a futile effort. It's a very dangerous effort. But unfortunately, these people believe it. I believe they can do that. So no, they didn't want to have. You may, like me, remember that thought we would get a peace dividend. It's like, well, if there's no Soviet Union, there's no need to spend all this money on defense, right? Remember that? But the exact opposite happened. They kicked them while they were down. This was an opportunity to expand Western, that is to say, capitalist hegemony. So former Soviet republics became independent and then became members of NATO. Warsaw Pact countries became members of NATO, but it's not enough for them. And I was having a conversation with someone earlier. These are people who don't believe in diplomacy. It's our way or the highway. So there was no honest discussion, no good faith negotiations with Russia because they want it all. They want Russia. And notice in the 90s, when oligarchs really ran Russia, I'm not going to say they have no power now, but Putin got them out of politics. Under Yeltsin, when oligarchs really ran Russia, it was fine with Washington. Yeltsin was our guy. So they did not want an independent Russia. They did not want a Russia that could be a competing power of the U.S., but it is a competing power.
Why do you think that is? Why wouldn't the United States want to have other nations develop to their full capacity under capitalism? And I'll, like, if you look back to after World War II, there was an effort to get the Japanese people, the Japanese nation, up and running, to reinvest in the Japanese economy, to develop them economically so that they would be integrated into a world capitalist system. And, later on in the 80s, we started to be a little bit concerned about the threat from Japan. I remember being, movies like Gung Ho. Do you remember that movie? Yeah, like, oh no, they're coming. They're gonna outcompete us. But it seems to me like the dream of capitalism is to have every nation be productive and democratic and riven with class problems. But why didn't we want an equal trading partner, productive trading partner, rather than this sort of region of chaos?
Their goal is supremacy. And so, every country's either, what did Bush say? You're either with us or against us. So that's it. You either have to be with us, you have to be a vassal state, or we have to crush you. So that means getting control of resources, or it could be oil, it could be gold, it could be anything. Sometimes it means just subjugating any country. Like, why does the U.S. need to determine who runs Nicaragua? It's a little country with 6 million people, and there are more people in New York City than there are in Nicaragua. Why do you care who runs Nicaragua?
Well, back then that was cast as a part of the Cold War, right? I mean,
they're still doing it. They're sanctioning Nicaragua, and as an example, the goal is now to have full domination, full spectrum dominance is the goal. Is to control everything and subjugate everyone. So China was first, everything was fine. China would make cheap products for Walmart, and China gets in the WTO. China's great until they develop economic prowess and they become a competitor. So now the goal is just to dominate. So nobody can be a friend who, unless they are an allied state, unless they're a puppet, then you can be, then everything's good. Or you can be one of these little countries that's just victimized all the time, and everybody else has to go along or be crushed, except that you can't do it without posing great dangers to the world. And having had Ukraine blow up in their faces, they're screwing around with China regarding Taiwan. And they want Taiwan to be the next Ukraine. So, and we have people who are delusional. I have to say that I find that there used to be these statesmen who, even if they did something that I thought was really horrible, they were smart people.
Mm-hmm.
But Biden and his team are incompetent. They are amateurs, and so are people in the rest of Europe. The UK, it's like if you're looking for a bigger bunch of morons, just go to London, or the new German chancellor. It's where the Europeans refuse to stand up for themselves. I mean, look what Germany did. They had this pipeline completed with Russia, and then gave it up after the U.S. instigated this crisis. But the short answer is, what they want is domination and peaceful coexistence and building up other countries. That's yesterday's news. It doesn't work for them.
Okay, so that was Margaret Kimberley. We're going to see the entirety of that interview later this week. Hopefully the noise of my breathing won't be quite as pronounced in the episode that's released later on. But what did you guys think of that conversation? And Stefan, maybe you can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess the thing that I've been thinking about, and I don't really have like a strong, confident answer to, is kind of, is Russia being on the other side something that was kind of basically necessary already in 1992, or is it something that was kind of contingent on kind of like who won kind of US presidential elections and kind of what terror attacks happened in the United States and when they happened? Like, I always think if kind of there was some kind of 9/11 event just a few years earlier, where
I'm bringing Reid in too. He can join us in a second if you want to, Reid. Or you want to join in? Okay, go ahead, Stefan.
Where, for instance, if 9/11 or a similar event had happened, say in 1998, while Russia was fighting the Chechen War, and when the US had a Democrat president, whatever, I can very easily see in my mind, US soldiers being deployed alongside Russian soldiers in Chechnya, because the kind of network of people that Russia was fighting in Chechnya were the people that are Al Qaeda or ISIS. That's kind of the really grim thing about Chechnya, is kind of the government is by far like the most brutal kind of regime in Russia by like a massive amount, but the opposition isn't at all better. They're Al Qaeda and they're ISIS. The significant opposition, obviously, there's always liberals everywhere, and I imagine there's probably still a few communists, though. All the Russian population of Chechnya was expelled in the 90s. But then, obviously, not everyone agrees. And Russian nationalists and kind of Russian leftists who are inclined that way think that kind of there could have never been peace, but that kind of like Russia was too big, even in 1992. Like, obviously, the USSR had been dismantled, but Russia was still like a very large state, biggest population in Europe, largest military, obviously massively important in oil and gas. And their view on it is that there couldn't be peace with Russia until Russia was broken up into all of its regions. And then only then could these countries become allies and puppets and this sort of thing, because they'd be broken down into parts that kind of the Western imperial order could handle.
Reid, did you want to jump in? Gene's here as well. Gene, did you want to say anything?
You can go ahead, Gene, if you have something.
Yeah, okay. Hi, guys. Nice to be on the show with you all. I would...
Gene is an editor at Sublation Magazine and a thorn in my side. Gene, go ahead.
I think Stefan is correct. I think there's certain contingencies that just led Russia down this path, which include obviously policies that the United States and Western Europe took towards Russia once it was defeated, which was shaped by the attitude of Eastern European states towards Russia. One has to remember, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, these Eastern European countries were not necessarily wanting to join NATO because sort of an anti-communist logic, but of a deeper historical fear that Russia has played a preeminent role in the history of Eastern Europe with military interventions, stretching back centuries. And, obviously you have a whole lot of nationalist-based fear and hostility that was to a certain degree masked during the Soviet era. So I think there's a lot of historical contingencies that led to this conflict, and there are logical reasons why this conflict ended up going this way. I think part of it, of course, is also to do with the revanchist nationalism that developed in Russia. One of the problems about the discourse around the Ukraine war is that people often try to present a binary, in that either it's all just evil Putin, or you end up with a kind of inverted argument where there was no agency on behalf of Russia. They had to respond in this way because this is what the Americans made them do. And I think not to attack Margaret Kimberley directly, but I would say definitely I think some of the way that she deploys discourse tends towards that direction that, well, the Russians had to develop in this direction. This was the only policy choice that Russia had. So I think we need to, as leftists, I don't think there's any benefit to taking a particular side in this war. I don't think supporting Russia or supporting the West benefits the workers' movement in a general sense. That's the first thing I would say. And the second thing I would say is, this. We have to look at this conflict in a nuanced way. At the end of the day, Putin chose to escalate the conflict, and there's enormous human cost on that. And as Stefan wrote quite eloquently, as much as they bring up the logic of anti-Nazi activism, the invasion itself will enhance the position of fascists in that country. And on the flip side, well, even when we learned about Nazi Germany in school, one of the factors that is often pointed out behind the rise of Nazi Germany is the harsh treaty imposed on Germany after the end of the First World War, which led to conditions in which revanchist nationalism became completely gained popular currency and a logic. So we have to understand this war as a kind of inter-capitalist conflict, and show sympathy. And as far as we have any power as leftists, it should be to assist refugees, call on governments to be helpful to refugees and to promote diplomacy, rather than signing on to policies that will extend the war. And I would note, compared to opposing the Iraq war, which was so egregious, it was very easy for those on to the left to oppose. To a certain degree, it's harder to oppose the invasion of Ukraine on a very visceral level, in that it's a big country just going ham and wailing on a smaller country and causing an enormous
you mean it's harder to oppose the U.S. arming of Ukraine? You don't mean harder to oppose the invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, it's harder.
I want to jump in and say we should wrap this up here and go over to the live stream for patrons. I want to give Ashley a chance to say goodbye because she's my co-host, and we're going to stick to the damn script. We have a goodbye segment to do, but then everyone can join us over on the Patreon. But Reid, did you have anything you want to throw in before I dump you all off the stream?
I just apropos of what Gene just said, I think, it brings to mind something I know Spencer Leonard said in a previous discussion with you, Doug, on your YouTube channel, which was that there is a global capitalist state, and it's divided up and managed through these various kind of national or transnational, sections, but they really have a kind of integral relationship and logic to one another. And precisely the way in which that state it extends and develops its power is through war between its various sections. Mm-hmm. So the war is, in a sense, a way of propping up this global political order that isn't like an antithesis to a chaos, but is precisely a means of managing chaos on a global scale that thrives through that chaos. So I agree with what Gene was saying in that regard. And what would it mean for the left to have the power to have a meaningful response to that? I think that's a question we need to think really seriously about and not take for granted that we already have the power to take a meaningful stand.
Or that we never could.
Right.
Stefan, I think that sets up what we'll talk about in the Patreon, because what he's talking about is this destruction, long-term destruction as a kind of management strategy is interesting, and I think we're taking up. Reid, if you're going to be around, you're joined.
I have about 10 minutes, so maybe just for the beginning.
All right. I'm going to throw you out. I'm going to throw you out. I'm going to throw you out. It's just me. Hi, Ashley. What did you think? That was the first Sublation Magazine show. Hopefully you can come back next week. If not, you can come back at least somewhere. Great. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I do speak, like. Yeah, I thought that was really great. And I'm looking forward to coming back next week. So I'm just going to be here to be the interregnum, the morbid symptom of the switch over to the Patreon. So I'm looking forward to joining you in the chat over there. So thanks everyone for joining us, and I look forward to you all joining us again next week.
All right, and I'm going to run the intro clip again. I should get an outro one, but I'm going to run this now.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living